Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We will focus on a topic that is constantly being identified by teachers as an area where they need more information and support. And the British Council runs the English Language Teaching Research Scheme. And one of the research papers published within it in 2017 was on the topic of assessment. We are joined today by three speakers, Vivian Berry, Sonia Monroe, and Susan Cian, who will present different parts of this webinar. In case you wish to comment or ask questions, you need to log in with your Gmail account, and then you will be able to write in the chat box that's just right of your video. And at the end of the session, we will leave 10 to 15 minutes in order to answer them. This webinar is being recorded, so you can use the same link to view the recording afterwards. We are now going over to our first presenter, Vivian. Vivian, if you please.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Vivian Berry from the British Council in London. I'm the one of the senior researchers in English language assessment in London. Okay, could we have the first slide, please? Nicola, could we have the first slide up, please? Thank you. Okay, today Susan and Sonia and I are going to talk about assessment, attitudes, practices, and needs. Next slide. Obviously, everything that we say is our opinions and not necessarily those of the British Council or the University of Huddersfield. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about four different things. I'm going to present an introduction to language assessment literacy and talk about a little bit of the previous research that's been done. And then Susan's going to tell you about the joint project, and Sonia's going to talk about all the materials that are available for you on the web. Okay, next slide, please. So the introduction. Next slide. What is assessment literacy, language assessment literacy in particular? Well, there are several definitions, but Meg Malone, United States researcher, says that assessment literacy is an understanding of the measurement basics related directly to classroom learning. Okay, so therefore, language assessment literacy extends this definition to issues specific to language classrooms. Next slide, please. Alan Davies, who's probably one of the best-known applied linguists in the world, talked about the components of assessment literacy in an article in 2008. And it's based on skills, knowledge, which have been talked about earlier, but then Alan Davies added principles. And what does this really mean for language teachers? Next slide, please. Okay, teachers need to have skills in identifying and evaluating appropriate assessments. Okay, I mean, depending on your learners. They need to be able to analyze the data that you get from the tests to improve your own instruction and practices. You also need knowledge to assess learners effectively so that you can maximize learning, okay, assessment for learning. You need the knowledge and understanding to interpret and apply assessment results appropriately. We've lost the slide, I think. Could we have the slide back, please? You also need an understanding of the principles and the practice of assessment. That doesn't mean necessarily you need to know lots about theory, but you do need to understand about the principles of why you're doing something. And then, of course, you need the wisdom to be able to integrate assessment and its outcomes into the whole of the teaching process. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Now, there have been quite a lot of studies into language assessment literacy, predominantly survey studies. As you can see, I and my colleague Barry O'Sullivan have done a few, the one I'm showing you in 2014. And I won't read out all the names of everybody because that would just be tedious. All of the references are at the end of the presentation, so you don't need to write anything down. If you're interested, you'll be able to see them at the end. Next slide. But there are problems with survey studies. For example, people who respond to them are probably those who are interested in the topic in the first place, and so they're self-selected. Another problem is that maybe teachers say what they think they should say rather than what they actually believe. That's not just true of language assessment literacy surveys, of course, it's true of any. The training needs might be exaggerated as well in the belief that it would seem unprofessional to say that you're not interested in a particular topic. And the other thing, of course, is that people might say, oh, yes, I'm interested, out of curiosity rather than a genuine need to know. And the other thing is that when responses to questionnaires are interpreted, they're always interpreted based on the statistics that have been carried out into them, so they may rely too heavily on that sort of analysis. Next slide, please. Now, there have been some studies, mixed methods and classroom observation studies, as you can see, quite a lot in the Far East, in China and in Australia, but in other places as well. Next slide, please. But the interesting thing is that there are obviously limitations to those kinds of studies as well. And the main one is that mixed methods generally include initial questionnaire survey responses and then a follow-up interview. And the follow-up interviews are usually designed to get further insights into the responses to the questionnaires. So all the limitations of survey studies also apply to mixed method studies. The other thing is that you can only answer the questions you've been asked. I don't know how many of you have done survey studies, but if you leave a blank box for people to put their own opinions, it usually stays very blank. And also, all the qualitative aspects of the mixed method studies are generally very, very small. For example, the Zhu and Carla study, which I was on the previous slide, followed 3 learners. Next slide, please. So the study that I just talked about, that I did with my colleague Barry O'Sullivan, was a survey of British Council teachers. We had about 700 and something responses from all over the world. Next slide, please. And they were, it was in 5 sections. They were asked personal information, why they assess things, what they do in the classroom, what their general assessment activities are, and any additional topics they're interested in. And they, next slide, they could give 3 responses. Yes, I need more training in this particular topic. No, I've got adequate training. Or no, it's irrelevant to my job. Next slide. And these are the topics that they're particularly interested in. Defining assessment criteria, fairly obviously, you need to know how to do that. Writing items, etc., as you can see all the slides. Surprisingly, they did express an interest in collecting validity evidence for tests. I think that's a word, validity and reliability, that everybody's heard of, and I think everybody says that they're interested in it because they feel they ought to be. I'm not sure how much they actually are. Next slide. Additional topics they're interested in, standard setting is again very important, but wash back in the classroom I would have thought would have been higher up on the list than that with classroom teachers. Use of tests in society. People use tests for all sorts of reasons that they shouldn't from time to time. the effect of local learning cultures, that's a very important feature of tests, how things are done differently in different parts of the world. But if you look at the next slide, please, they're not interested in history of language testing, use of advanced statistics, large-scale testing, or, surprisingly, test administration. So I'll now hand you over to Susan and the next slide, and she will tell you about the joint project. Thank you.
So, good morning everybody, or good afternoon. I'm Susan Sheehan and I'm Senior Lecturer TESOL here at the University of Huddersfield. I'm going to talk about the methodology that we used for our project, the people we spoke to, and then my colleague Sonia will talk about the results and the materials which we developed as the basis of the project. Okay. Next slide, please. So as Vivian mentioned, a lot of survey research has been used around this topic, and we wanted to move to a more qualitatively orientated approach. So we wanted to talk to people, we wanted to observe people, we wanted to move away from questionnaires, we wanted to talk directly to teachers, and we wanted to bring the teacher's voice into the debate because we felt they perhaps hadn't had a strong enough, prominent enough place in the debate thus far. Our other aim was to develop training materials for teachers which covered 5 areas identified by the teachers as being of importance. Because there's a lot of assessment material available, and some of the other assessment survey projects developed materials based on the results of those surveys, but they tended to be written by people who love testing, have dedicated their life to testing and assessment, and perhaps they've not always considered the needs of the teachers, or perhaps they haven't always considered that perhaps other people may not be as interested in the topic as perhaps they themselves are. Next slide, please. So the participants for the project were all based in Europe when we spoke to them, but they had all worked in a variety of different contexts. So we had people who could talk about working in Saudi Arabia, across Southeast Asia, but they were all based in Europe at the time we spoke to them, and a number of them were based in the UK. We followed Voigt and Sagari and used a very broad definition of what we mean by an EFL teacher. So who we could include was very broad, and that I think reflects that teachers who teach English teach in a variety of different settings, a variety of different educational levels and different contexts, public sector, private sector. So we wanted to speak to as many different types of teachers as we could, bearing in mind that in a qualitatively orientated study, we weren't looking to speak to large numbers of people. We were looking to speak to smaller numbers, but perhaps in greater depth. The teachers had come through to the profession through a variety of routes. So some teachers had a BA or a BA education in English language teaching. Other teachers had a qualification like a PGCE or a CELTA and had come into teaching through different routes. So we felt we were able to talk about a range of training experiences, and Capture had some teachers had more, perhaps having gone through the BA approach where they had 3 years, perhaps looking at teachers who'd done a CELTA, which is obviously a very compact course and is only a month, and perhaps they had had less assessment. Next slide, please. So there were 4 stages of data collection. The first set of interviews were conducted in the UK, again with teachers who'd worked in a variety of different contexts. And this was, we called them baseline interviews. So we were looking at people's experiences of training, and we were looking at how they then had used that training and how that had influenced their classroom practice. We were asking what they felt was the impact of testing and assessment on their classroom, and if in the span of their career they had gone on to have further training in addition to their initial teacher training qualification. We then set up a series of observations and interviews, and again these were conducted in the UK at an international study centre, and we observed the teachers using an observation schedule. So the schedule was inspired by work by Colby, Kelly and Turner, and it listed a range of assessment behaviours, and we would watch the lessons and tick when we observed a particular behaviour, and every 3 minutes we would start a new sheet. On the sheet we also had room for notes, so if we saw an example of self-assessment, we could make notes about what the students were doing, how they were self-assessing themselves, what the teacher was doing at that time. So we were able to get a pretty good view of what was happening, and afterwards we spoke to the teachers and we were able to ask them about particular incidents. So we were able to say, at this point in your lesson you did this, can you talk about what you were thinking at the time, can you lead us through your thought processes? So that was very interesting to be able to not only see the teachers but also go and ask them what they were thinking at the time, and that produced a lot of insights about how assessment decisions are made whilst teaching, and kind of how assessment and teaching are very much interlinked or intertwined. We also asked the teachers that we interviewed about their experiences of training and the impact that testing and assessment has on their classroom practice. The third stage of data collection were a series of focus group interviews which were held in 2 European capital cities. And here we were asking the teachers again about their training experiences, but the focus groups were particularly looking at or talking about how the training needs of the teachers. So we were asking them what training needs they had, what topics they would be interested in learning more about. We were also looking at asking them about the format of the training materials, how much time they would have to look at them, how they would like to access the materials, and getting a sense of what they felt would be helpful to their everyday teaching practice in terms of assessment. The final stage of data collection was a workshop, and this was held at an IATEFL conference in the UK. So at the workshop, there was a variety of participants from all over the world, and obviously we had no control over who came to the workshop, but we were lucky that a wide range of people came with different experiences, and they gave us some very helpful information and ideas about the training materials, what should be included in them, what should not be included in them. And there was a large-scale revision to the training materials after the workshop, because we realised that what teachers valued were materials which could be accessed online, which could be accessed on the go, and which perhaps didn't necessitate extended periods of time looking at the materials. Rather, it's materials which people could dip in and out of as they needed. Next slide, please. So as Vivian mentioned, Davis's work on the components of assessment literacy, and when we came to analyse the data, this was the framework which we used to code the data. So it was qualitative data, so we were looking mainly at transcripts of the interviews, the focus groups, the workshop, and we were looking for when teachers were talking about skills, when they were talking about knowledge, when they were talking about principles, or all three combined. Principles was the one which was least talked about. So teachers tended to be focusing on skills and knowledge. Fewer teachers were talking about principles. And I'll now pass you over to my colleague Sonia, who will discuss the findings and the materials which we developed as the result of the data collection process. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Sonia Munro, and like Susan, I work at the University of Huddersfield, where I'm also a senior lecturer in TESOL. And I'm going to talk to you about two areas of the research project that we did. So firstly, I'll talk about the key findings from the project. And secondly, I'll tell you a little bit about the materials or the toolkit that we designed and show you some of the materials that we have designed. So if we could have a look at the next slide, please. So in terms of the findings, there are 4 key areas that I'm going to talk about, and I'll start by summarising them first, and then I'll move on to talking about each of them in more detail. So the first point is that in our interviews and focus groups, teachers talked a lot about the lack of training that they'd had in the area of testing and assessment. Those who had had some training felt that the topics they'd studied were of relevance to them in the classroom. But in terms of the teachers who didn't have any training or in assessment, as I'll talk about later, they didn't really see this training or this lack of training as being problematic, because they felt that they really needed more experience to understand and relate to testing and assessment. And because they had so many other things to learn about at the start of their training, they felt that assessment was really something that they could pick up on later. The second key finding was that despite the lack of training, the teachers that we observed used a wide range of effective assessment practices. However, when we talked to them about what they did, they described this more as part of good teaching rather than as assessment. So, and the third point was that when we talked to teachers and we asked them about assessment, we found that they talked much more about testing rather than the broader range of assessment approaches. Finally, when we asked teachers about their training needs, there was a very consistent message. So teachers requested lots of practical ideas and activities, but they didn't really express an interest in any theory. So I'll now talk to you in more detail about each of these points. So if we could look at the next slide, please. So in terms of our first finding, in our focus groups and interviews, we asked teachers about the type of training they'd had in assessment, and if they had had any, which kinds of topics they'd covered. And we found overall that teachers felt that they'd had very little training in this area. Only 3 teachers that we spoke to were able to talk in any depth about the training relating to assessment that they'd had either in their initial teacher education or in their continuing professional development. But most teachers said that they'd had very little training in this area, but they didn't see this as being a problem. So if we look at the first quotation here, for example, we can see that this teacher felt that as a new teacher, there were simply so many things that they had to focus on. They didn't really view assessment as being top of the list of things they wanted to learn more about. And there was a real sense that beginner teachers wanted to focus more on what they considered to be the nuts and bolts of teaching, so lesson planning and teaching techniques. And of course, some people may consider that assessment forms part of the basics of teaching, but our participants said that the focus of their initial teacher education courses was very much on teaching, and they weren't actually required to assess students as part of their courses, and therefore they didn't really feel that they needed to learn more about this area. And this can be seen here in quotes 2 and 3, where the teachers clearly express the focus of their early training was teaching, and consequently, because they weren't required to test or assess students, they didn't want to learn any more about this. It's also apparent, I think, from the final quotation here that some teachers felt that they weren't interested in the area of testing and assessment and didn't see their lack of training as a problem because they had very little influence over the assessments that were done in their particular context. This was perhaps because they were carried out externally by an awarding body such as Cambridge or Trinity, or because they were designed or administered by other users or other people in the organisation, for example, by managers or staff who had particular responsibility for testing and assessment. However, despite not wanting to develop their knowledge of this early in their career, teachers did feel that it was something that they could return to later, once they had more experience. And in fact, one teacher we talked to said that she hadn't studied much about testing and assessment in the early stages of her career, but she was thinking about applying for promotion and therefore needed to learn more about this, because in her context, it was the managers who made the decisions about assessment, and therefore assessment knowledge was more important at managerial level than it was at the level of being a teacher. And so this really reinforced the idea that teachers in the early stages of their career didn't need to learn about assessment. They just wanted to learn more about teaching. But if they wanted to go for promotion, it was more important for them to learn more about assessment. There were some teachers we spoke to who said that their training had covered topics related to testing and assessment. And they said that they're very positive about this. They said that they'd found it interesting and relevant. But they also said that they thought that teachers needed experience to really understand assessment, and in particular to get a feel of levels of students. So in other words, what an A1 or a B2 student looks like. And they felt that this experience is gained really through time and through practice and through working with students, rather than just studying assessment. So because of this, again, similar to the teachers who hadn't had a lot of training in this area, they didn't feel that it was essential to cover a lot of this in the early stages of their career, but they thought that it was something they could come back to later on. So if we could have a look at the next slide, I'll move on to our second finding. And here, it was very interesting to us that despite the lack of training that teachers reported in relation to assessment, in our observations, we found that teachers actually demonstrated a really wide range of assessment techniques, and they did this very effectively. So we saw them, for example, using peer and self-assessment. We saw them sharing explicitly criteria and helping students to understand how they were being assessed and the areas that they needed to develop. We saw them use test papers for formative assessment. And we also saw teachers who really encouraged students to reflect on their strengths and their areas for development, and then to action plan in relation to this. So students were encouraged to think about what they would do next time in order to develop specific aspects of their work. We also saw teachers using what McKay calls on-the-fly assessment, in which teachers respond to learners and adapt the pace and the content of the lesson or activity based on their learners' needs at that specific point in time. So, and something you'll all be very familiar with, I'm sure, is the idea of simplifying an activity because it's too difficult for your students. And we saw teachers do this very effectively. What was interesting for us was that when we talked to teachers after the observations and asked them about the techniques we'd seen them use, they classified these activities not as assessment, but just as part of teaching, and specifically part of good teaching. So this really raised questions for us about how teachers had developed these practices. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see here we have two quotations from our participants. And the quotations on this side show how teachers reported that they felt that they'd really learned about assessment through experience. So if we look at the first quote here, where the teacher says that She built up her ideas of assessment through experience of what students are capable of doing. She's clearly articulating how working with students has helped to develop her practice and her understanding of assessment. The second quote, I think, is also interesting because it highlights another factor that influences how our teachers developed their understanding of assessment. And this time, it relates not to their experience of teaching, but their experiences of being a student themselves. And here, the participant is describing how their own experiences of being assessed in school has contributed to their practices as a teacher. Now, this phenomenon is referred to by Lorty as the apprenticeship of observation. And this is the idea that when we're at school, we spend thousands and thousands of hours observing teachers. And this then influences the beliefs we hold about teaching and learning, and also our classroom practices. So you've probably heard people say in the past that teachers teach the way they were taught themselves. And here, perhaps it's true that teachers assess the way they were assessed themselves. And in this second quote, therefore, we see that this teacher has been influenced by their experiences as a school pupil and is actually applying the practices they saw when they were at school in their own role as a teacher. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, we can look at our third finding. And here we found that when we talked to teachers about assessment, they talked first and foremost about testing. So, for example, some of them talked about their experiences in terms of item writing, creating tests, grading, or working with exam classes. Other participants we talked to actually talked about a lack of involvement in testing, either because they didn't need to grade students, because testing was done externally, or because perhaps they didn't teach exam classes. However, what they didn't do was talk about assessment in broader terms. So, for example, they didn't talk about assessment for learning or learning-oriented language assessment. And what I mean by that is approaches that use informal and formal assessment to help teachers plan learning more effectively and measure progress and identify areas for improvement. And this wasn't really something that teachers talked about. They talked very much about testing. They also didn't really talk about how they planned for assessment or the assessment decisions that they make in action while they're teaching. So the kinds of decisions I mentioned in terms of the previous findings that McKay refers to as on-the-fly assessment. And the quotes that you have on the screen now illustrate the kinds of responses when we ask teachers about assessment. And you'll notice here that they all refer to testing specifically, but our questions, the questions we asked them, were actually about assessment more generally. So perhaps we see here that teachers very much associate assessment first and foremost with testing rather than other areas of assessment. Now, can we have a look at the next slide, please? So I'm going to turn to our final findings now. And as Susan said earlier, the aim of our research project was to investigate teachers' attitudes, practices, and needs relating to assessment. And as part of this, we wanted to design a set of training materials or a toolkit which teachers could use to develop their knowledge and practices relating to assessment. As part of the focus group, the interviews, and the ITEFL workshop that Susan's already talked about, we asked teachers about the kind of materials that they thought would be most useful to them. And we found overwhelmingly that teachers wanted practical ideas and activities relating to assessment, and they weren't interested in theory. So in terms of the kinds of things they asked for, lots of teachers reported that they wanted more on issues relating to level. So they talked very much about lacking confidence in using the CFR in particular, and how they wanted much more concrete examples of level. So they really wanted examples of what a student at B1 looks like, or what a student at A2 can do. And they wanted lots of samples of students speaking or writing in particular at particular language levels, but also using language in everyday situations rather than just in exam situations. So they commented, for example, that you can find examples of B1 students or A1 students on various awarding body websites, but they really wanted more in relation to students using language in everyday situations, where they weren't just confined to certain kinds of language that are generated in assessment activities. A lot of teachers also said that they wanted more about testing of the skills and assessing skills rather than assessing grammar. So they asked for examples of assessment tasks and of criteria used to assess the skills. And as shown by the last quotation, some teachers said that they wanted very practical activities, the kind that could be picked up and used immediately. And the final quote on this slide is actually from somebody who had had lots of theoretical content in his initial teacher education, but there was very little in relation to assessment in class, more practical ideas. And the message that teachers gave us was very clear. They said they were busy, that they have demanding timetables and heavy workloads, and that they don't always have the time to research ideas or areas that they'd like to know more about. And they don't always have the time to design assessment tasks themselves. And therefore, what they wanted above all was materials which would help them improve their classroom practice in the area of assessment. So if we look at the next slide, I'm now going to talk about the materials that we have actually designed. And as Susan said earlier, we did actually make a lot of changes as we worked on the materials, and we responded very much to the feedback that we got, the data that we got from our participants, and also the feedback that we got at IATEFL. And it was very clear that our participants didn't want lots of guided readings. But when we initially started to think about materials, we actually intended to design a set of materials that could be used as part of group CPD activities. So in other words, they'd be used by a trainer working with a group of teachers. And they were to consist of trainers' notes, PowerPoint, resources, and guided readings from journal articles. But after talking to the participants and reviewing our data, we felt that this approach really had several limitations. So firstly, it relied on there being an experienced trainer who was willing and able to deliver the materials. And of course, not organisations all have teachers who are willing to do this. Also, it meant that teachers would have to wait until enough participants could be found and a trainer was available. And we felt that these factors would really limit the potential usefulness of the materials, because teachers are clearly stated that they wanted things that they could use immediately. And so we felt that a more flexible approach was needed, one where teachers could access the materials at any time, and also could choose materials that were of most interest to them. So we decided that we would create a set of online materials, and we chose 5 key areas relating to the kinds of topics that teachers had requested them. And if we look at the next slide, you can see here that the list of the 5 topics that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, each one is standalone, and that means that they can be accessed separately. So teachers can do one, they can do a few of them, they can do all of them, and they can be studied in any order. I think it's important to note that these materials, this toolkit is aimed at in-service teachers of English, so those who are working or have worked as English teachers, because the tasks often ask the participants to reflect on their role or their experiences with students. So for this reason, they're not aimed at pre-service or beginner teachers because of this requirement to have some experience to reflect on. Now, the materials are located out on the British Council's website, and I've put a link for you here to show where you'll be able to find them. Not all the materials are available yet, but they will be very, very shortly. If you don't want to write down that web link, the easiest way is to Google English Agenda and then Sheehan and Munro, and that will also bring up the relevant link for you. So what I'm going to do now is actually show you some of the materials. I'm only going to show you a small section of them because obviously we have some time restraints, but hopefully this will give you a flavour of how the materials are designed and the kinds of activities that are required. So if we could have a look at the next slide, the materials that I'm going to show you are on the topic of assessing young learners, and these are available on the web link from the previous slide. So if you'd like to look at these properly after this webinar, then you'll be able to do so. Now, if we can look at the next slide, please, you can see here the learning outcomes for this particular module or set of materials. So in terms of the first one, these materials help teachers to develop an awareness of the characteristics of young learners. So by this we mean who they are, what is significant about them, and how this impacts how we assess young learners. Outcome 2, teachers, as we've said that they didn't want lots of theory, but we do point teachers in the direction of useful research projects and discuss their findings. But we do this in a way that is very much related to practice and is accessible to teachers from a range of backgrounds and with a range of experience. And then our final outcome here shows that all our toolkit materials have a very practical focus and give lots of examples of activities that teachers can try in their everyday practice. So if we look at the next slide, and this is the one of the first activities here, and you'll see here that participants are asked to watch a short video, and the link is available there. And I was hoping that we'd be able to watch part of that video now, but unfortunately technology doesn't allow it. So you'll have to look at these materials afterwards so you get to see this great little video that we have here. This slide really is typical in the sense that we use a range of media throughout the toolkit materials, and we have links to videos, we have audio recordings, we have links to other websites as well, and in particular some of the excellent existing resources which are on the British Council website, and Vivian is going to talk about those briefly later on. But you can see here that the task is to watch the video and answer a few simple questions. And following this, if we can look at the next slide, what typically follows an activity like this is a very brief commentary, a summary of the content of the video. And the videos that we've chosen because they relate to practice first and foremost, because they are accessible, they are easy to understand, and they're also used to develop teachers' knowledge, skills and understanding of key issues relating to testing and assessment. And so after watching the video and the commentary, if we look at the next slide, you can see that then teachers are asked to reflect on their own knowledge, their own context, their own experience. And this is a theme throughout the material. So teachers are encouraged to reflect throughout and think about how they assess young learners. And in this case, list all the different ways that they currently assess their learners. And the slides that then follow this talk about different ways that learners can be assessed. It looks at some research that has been done previously about how young learners are assessed, talks about the findings of that, and then throughout the materials provides practical examples of different ways that young learners can be assessed. And we cover lots of different topics. So we look, for example, at things like the use of testing and large-scale tests and the advantages and limitations of large-scale tests. But we also look at things like ways of assessing students and young learners in particular without testing. So things like observation, portfolio and project work and so on. Now, obviously, there isn't time to show you all the slides. So if we could just turn to the next slide. If you this slide here, there's a little bit more to read. This slide comes later on in the toolkit and is a reflection task in which teachers are asked to devise their own oral assessment for a group of young learners. And again, this is a reflection task which requires teachers to draw on the knowledge they've gained from working through the rest of their toolkit. And this comes towards the end of materials. So obviously leading up to this, there has been a discussion of different kinds of oral assessment. And then this task is a way of bringing together all the points that they've studied so far. But the aim of this kind of task is to encourage teachers to think about their practice, devise an assessment based on effective principles of assessment which have been covered in the rest of the materials. So I've shown you here samples of the materials, and we really hope that first of all you'll go and look at them, but also that you will find them useful yourselves. I did put a link earlier on in the presentation to the materials, but if we also look at the next slide, you can see here that a link is here to the full research project. And if you access this link, you will find a more detailed discussion and summary of the project and our findings to date. So there are several useful resources that you'll be able to access here, but there are other materials that you may also find useful on the topic of testing and assessment. And I'm going to pass you back to Vivian now, who's going to just talk briefly about some materials which are available on the British Council's website, which also support teachers developing their knowledge in this area. So if we could just go to the next slide, and then I'll pass you back to Vivian.
Thank you very much, Sonia. You will see the title, Introducing Language Assessment. That's a series of 12 videos, of which the Young Learners one is one of them. And we have a series of 12 mostly very practical videos. I'll show you the list of the titles in just a second. There are 12 video animations, and each of them has a transcript available. Then for the first 6 of the topics, there are worksheets and answer keys that you can go through if you would like to. The URL is there. If we could go to the next slide, please. These are the topics. So you will see the first 6 are very practical. I won't read them all out for you, and they have the worksheets and the answer keys. The next one, Assessing Young Learners, Sonia has just been talking about. Then we also have an animated video on the CEFR and language assessment. So if you're interested and you would like to, each of the animations is about between 5 and 6 minutes long. You can stop them, start them, watch them all the way through. But if you're interested in any of those topics, then please go back to the URL and click on it and have a look at them. As I said, All the references that we gave are available on the last 4 slides, which we won't bother to show you. You can go to them if you want to. If we could just have the next slide, please. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. And this is how you can contact us if you would like to. Thank you. If you have any questions, please let us know and we'll try to answer them. Are there any questions? Apparently there are no questions. So we'll just thank you very much. And if you think of anything in the future, do get in touch with us or do go and access the URLs that we've given you in this presentation. Thank you very much.